the heart of civilization. But in 1890, beneath its polite society, the city hid a punishment so cruel it was erased from every public record. A punishment designed not to wound the body, but to fracture the mind. They called it the mirror room. For 10 years, one woman lived inside it. No sunlight, no clock, just her reflection, multiplied 1,000 times until she forgot which one was real. Her name was Eliza Holloway, 23 years old. A factory seamstress turned social threat after she dared to accuse a magistrate of indecency, a man twice her age and 10 times her power. The newspapers called her unstable, the courts called her hysterical, and the city decided she needed correction. That correction stood at the edge of North London, a gray, ivy-covered building known as Holloway House. To the public, it was a charity asylum for fallen women. To those inside, it was a laboratory for the rich, a place where the powerful tested how much of a person could be erased before she stopped being human. When the carriage stopped at its gate, Eliza's hands were bound in white cloth. A symbol of purity, they said. But even purity could not stop the stench of rot that leaked from the old stone walls. 2 attendants led her down a narrow corridor that grew colder with every step. The air thickened, no sound but the echo of her boots and the distant drip of water. At the end of the hallway stood a single iron door. Above it, etched in brass, 2 words, Room 12. The matron, tall and severe, spoke only once. You will stay here until you see the truth in yourself. The door shut. The lock turned. And Eliza Holloway met her reflection, not once but hundreds of times. Ceiling, floor, every wall, all glass. Every movement returned to her, like an army of silent witnesses. At first she screamed. The echoes came back louder, folding into each other until her own voice sounded like a stranger's. Then came the silence, long, perfect, endless. Hours passed, or maybe days. In the mirror room, time didn't move forward. It circled, endlessly. Her breathing filled the space. Her pulse became the clock. And then, somewhere behind the eye, layers of reflection, she thought she saw movement, subtle, delayed. Her reflection blinked a second late, then it smiled. But she didn't. That was the moment Eliza understood. The mirror room wasn't built for punishment. It was built for something far darker. By the second week, Eliza no longer screamed. Her throat had grown raw from the first 3 nights. Now she simply watched herself breathe, blink, and break, again and again, through the silvered glass. But on the morning of the 14th day, something changed. When she lifted her hand, one of her reflections didn't. It stood perfectly still. For a heartbeat, she thought she imagined it, the light maybe, or her mind playing tricks. But then the figure smiled. She stumbled backward, her shoulder slamming into the wall behind her. The other reflections rippled, like water. But that one stayed still, frozen in place, staring at her with a grin that didn't belong to her face. The corners of its mouth twitched too high, too wide. Then suddenly everything returned to normal. Every reflection matched her movement again, perfectly in sync. Eliza sat on the cold floor, shaking. Her mind whispered what she didn't want to believe. You've been here too long. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time dissolved into repetition. Sleep came in bursts. Hunger was a dull ache. She counted her breaths, traced patterns on the mirrors, whispered the days aloud just to hear her own voice. And that was when she heard it. Another whisper. It wasn't hers. It came from behind the glass. A woman's voice. Faint, trembling, almost afraid to be heard. He watches through us. The words echoed softly, fading before Eliza could respond. She pressed her palm to the mirror, feeling its chill pulse beneath her skin. Nothing. Just silence. That night, she couldn't sleep. The lantern flickered. Shadows fractured across the mirrored walls, twisting her own face into hundreds of strangers. Each reflection seemed slightly wrong. One blinked slower. One turned its head before she did. And one, the one in the far left corner, never looked away. Days later, she tried to test it. She stood still for hours, eyes locked on that reflection. No movement, no breath. Then, blink. Her reflection's eyes shifted, following something behind her. She spun around. Empty room. Only the sound of her heartbeat pounding in the silence. Eliza began to whisper to herself, to stay sane. But even her own whispers started answering back. Delayed, distorted, like an echo crawling out of another mouth. She found scratches on one mirror, faint, almost invisible beneath years of grime. Her fingers traced the grooves, feeling each carved letter. A sentence, half hidden beneath the reflection. "I've been here before." Her pulse stopped. Someone had written that from the inside. The room suddenly felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls were leaning inward, forcing her reflection closer. She backed away until her spine hit the glass. And then, faintly, she heard it again, from every direction. A whisper multiplied 100 times over, repeating the same words she had just read. "I've been here before. I've been here before. I've been here before." Eliza screamed, but the echoes didn't sound like her anymore. The next morning, Dr. Finch noted in his journal, Subject 27 exhibiting early signs of dissociation, progress satisfactory. He underlined the word progress twice, because for him her madness wasn't tragedy, it was data. London, 1890. To the public, Holloway House was an institution for the morally unstable, a place where women were sent to regain their virtue and composure. But deep beneath its polished corridors and perfumed halls, it was something far darker. Something funded in secret by men who believed that the human mind could be rewired. At the center of this darkness stood Dr. Aldous Finch. Finch was not a monster in appearance. He was polite, educated, with a voice that dripped civility and reason. But behind his gold-rimmed spectacles hid the mind of a man obsessed with purity, control, and obedience. He believed that sin wasn't spiritual, it was psychological. That through isolation, reflection, and deprivation, the human mind could be cleansed, made docile, submissive, pure. And women, he argued, were the perfect subjects. Finch's writings, hidden from the public, spoke of female hysteria as a curable disease. He claimed that vanity and emotional rebellion were the root causes of sin in women. So he built a therapy that reflected their greatest flaw, literally. The mirror room was his invention. Every inch of its surface, every corner and curve, was designed to reflect. Not for light, but for introspection. He wanted the women to see themselves endlessly, until their identity dissolved into obedience. He called it reflective isolation therapy. His peers called it revolutionary. No one called it torture, not officially. Eliza Holloway, he decided, would be his masterpiece. A woman of intellect unafraid to challenge men in power. A journalist who had exposed a nobleman's cruelty and refused to apologize. Her punishment was never meant for correction. It was meant for demonstration. Finch wanted to prove that even the most defiant spirit could be reprogrammed through reflection and silence. In his private logbook, dated April 17, 1890, he wrote, Subject 27, Eliza Holloway. Shows resistance uncommon to prior subjects. Excellent candidate for full cycle exposure. Estimated duration 10 years. 10 years. That was the duration of her sentence. But not by law, by design. Every day, Finch observed her from a hidden corridor behind the two-way mirrors. There, through a slit of glass, he watched as Eliza's sanity slowly unraveled. He documented everything, her pacing patterns, her periods of silence, her conversations with reflections that weren't her own. He would tilt his head slightly, taking notes in neat, looping handwriting. Subject now responds to non-existent stimuli. Displays guilt-based self-hatred. Beginning to reject identity. To Finch, this was success. He believed the mind could be purged of sin only when it was stripped of self. The mirror room was not punishment. It was purification. Each time Eliza screamed, he smiled. Each time she begged for mercy, he called it progress. In one session log, he wrote, "There is no cruelty here, only cleansing. The reflection is the cure." Behind the mirrors, the air was colder. Finch often stood alone there, candle in hand, his face illuminated by the faint, distorted reflection of the woman on the other side. Sometimes he would whisper to her through the walls, softly, almost affectionately, "You'll thank me one day, Eliza. The world outside is sick. I'm teaching you to be whole." But what Finch didn't realize was that the mirror room had a consciousness of its own, a silent observer that had watched many women before Eliza. It remembered every scream, every tear, every broken mind left behind its silver surface. And now, it was learning to reflect more than faces. It was reflecting souls. The nights were the worst. In the mirror room, the lamps dimmed automatically, at dusk leaving Eliza with only her reflection for company. Countless reflections, all breathing with her in the faint light, a silent army of herself. But soon, silence was no longer her enemy. It was the whispers. At first it was faint, a soft hum like the memory of a voice. She thought it was her mind creating noise in the suffocating quiet. But then, on the 6th night, as she pressed her forehead to the cold glass, she heard it clearly. A woman's voice, hoarse, trembling, close, as if coming from behind the mirror. "He said I'd be clean. He said I'd see the light again." Eliza jerked back, her heart hammering in her chest. Her reflection mimicked her fear, all but one. That reflection still had its lips moving, silently whispering long after she had stopped. The next night, more voices came. Dozens of them. Some sobbing, some laughing, others murmuring prayers in broken tones. They echoed faintly like ghosts trapped in glass. And through the noise, one phrase returned again and again, from different voices, in different tones. "We vanished, Eliza. We all vanished." She began clawing at the walls, trying to find where the sound was coming from. But the mirror only showed her bleeding fingers multiplied 100-fold. She screamed at the glass, "Who are you?" And in reply, the whispers rose in unison, the words overlapping, haunting, "We were you once." From that night onward, Eliza could no longer tell where her reflection ended and the voices began. Her own thoughts came back to her, distorted, echoed, repeated, sometimes when she laughed. The reflections laughed a second too late, mocking, delayed, inhuman. Her sense of self began to dissolve. When she slept, she dreamed of women in white gowns, their faces half erased, their hands pressed against the inside of mirrors like prisoners pounding on invisible doors. She began recognizing them. Names she'd read once in old newspapers, names that had vanished from history without explanation. Charlotte Graves, Margaret Ellis, Lydia Crane. Each one a patient of Dr. Finch's treatment, each one erased from public record after being declared reformed. But none had ever truly left the mirror room. Now, their souls were whispering through the glass, warning her, or begging her to join them. Somewhere behind the walls, Finch continued his silent observation. He watched Eliza's slow collapse with professional fascination. Her trembling, her muttering, the moments when she spoke to no one. He saw her kneel before the mirrors, pressing her hands to the surface as if in prayer. In his private journal, he wrote in that same neat, deliberate hand, subject 27, beginning stage 3, self-identity erosion successful. Whispers indicate auditory hallucination. Expected. To him, the whispers were proof of progress. To Eliza, they were proof that she was no longer alone, and that something inside the glass was alive. While Eliza's mind was beginning to fracture inside the mirror room, outside those walls a far darker truth was taking shape, one that extended far beyond Holloway House itself. The narrator's tone shifts now, from the claustrophobic horror of Eliza's torment to the cold precision of history, because the mirror room was not an isolated cruelty. It was part of a system, one built on silence, privilege, and the warped morality of Victorian England. In the late 19th century, London's social order ran on the fear of disgrace. A woman could be labeled mad or morally unstable for something as trivial as refusing a marriage, reading philosophy, or showing defiance toward a husband, and once the label stuck, there was no escape. Victorian asylums for women were less about treatment and more about control. Husbands, fathers, and even judges could have a woman committed without trial. She might have been perfectly sane, but the moment she entered those walls, she ceased to exist. Newspapers called them sanctuaries of reform. But their true purpose was to erase disobedience. Holloway House was the crown jewel of this deception. It was funded not by the government, but by London's most powerful men and judges, church leaders, industrialists, and even a few members of parliament. They saw Finch's work as something noble, a scientific way to keep women in line, cloaked in the language of morality. Donations flowed quietly through private accounts and charitable trusts. In return, Finch provided results. Women who re-emerged silent, compliant, or in most cases, never re-emerged at all. He called it rehabilitation. They called it progress. But behind closed doors, it was simply erasure. Inside the room, Eliza's world had narrowed to whispers and shadows. Her only contact with the outside came through the faint sounds of machinery behind the walls, the click of gears, the scrape of a pen, the hiss of gas lamps, until one night, while tracing a crack near the floor, her fingers found something strange, a loose panel. It wasn't part of the polished mirror surface. It was hidden behind a thin layer of dust and paint. Her nails pried at the edges until the glass shifted with a dull, metallic groan. Behind it, the darkness opened, a hollow cavity between the mirrors, and there in the dust was a single handprint, not hers. Too small, too old, pressed deep into the wall as if left by someone trying to escape. Beneath it, faint scratches in the plaster spelled something she could barely read under the flickering light. He keeps us in reflection. Eliza's breath caught. Her trembling fingers brushed against something else, a scrap of paper wedged between the panels. It was a medical report dated 3 years before her confinement. The name at the top, Charlotte Graves. Diagnosis: emotional hysteria due to public humiliation. Treatment duration, indefinite. And in the corner, Finch's unmistakable signature. Back in the shadowed corridor, Finch prepared his next report. His pen scratched steadily across the page, documenting progress. He didn't know that his perfect subject was starting to uncover the truth. A truth he'd buried behind mirrors, signatures, and silence. For days after finding the handprint, Eliza couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it. The faint outline of a desperate palm pressed into the wall, trapped behind the glass. It wasn't just a mark. It was proof that someone had been here before her, and perhaps someone still was. The air inside the mirror room had changed. It felt heavier now, thicker, as if the room itself were watching her. When she moved, she began noticing something impossible. A shadow, faint, almost imperceptible, moved with her reflection, but not quite like it. It lagged, lingered, sometimes twisted in ways her body didn't. And when she stood perfectly still, the shadow still shifted as if breathing. At first, she told herself it was exhaustion, the hallucinations Finch wanted her to have. But one night, when the lamps flickered and her reflection blurred, the shadow stepped closer. Her pulse thundered. She stumbled back, but the mirrored figures advanced. Not in sync, not as her reflection, but as something else. For a split second, she saw eyes within the glass. Not hers. Wide and pleading, staring at her through the silvered veil. Outside the chamber, Dr. Finch watched her tremble and scream. He turned the dial on his control box, increasing the flicker frequency of the gas lamps. He called it treatment intensification. He wanted to see how long the human mind could endure terror before fracturing completely. He wrote in his notes, Subject 27 demonstrates external projection hallucination. Stage 4 initiated, reflection response achieved. He believed she was projecting her madness onto the glass. But to Eliza, what she saw wasn't madness. It was communication. The whispers had returned, louder now. They spoke in half-sentences, layered voices, and faint sobs that echoed behind every pane. Sometimes she could swear the reflections mouthed words she didn't speak. And one phrase kept returning, conned again and again, like a chant from the other side. Write it. Write it so we can see. Her trembling hands searched the floor until she found a shard of mirror she had broken days ago. She pressed it to the wall and began to scratch, carving words backward into the glass so that whoever, or whatever was inside could read them. Letter by letter, the message appeared. Who are you? The whispering stopped. For the first time in weeks, there was silence. Then a faint hiss like the exhale of someone very close. And slowly, the fog from her breath formed words on the glass, backward answering her message. "Help me." Her knees buckled. She fell against the wall, sobbing. She wasn't just losing her mind, she was sharing it with something trapped inside. In the observation room, Finch adjusted the lamps again, unaware of what had just transpired. He noted increased engagement with reflections, labeling it a significant psychological event. But as he leaned closer to the glass, his own reflection blinked a second too late. For the first time, Finch hesitated. He pressed his hand to the mirror, separating him from his subject. And in the dim light, another hand pressed back from the other side. While Eliza's mind deteriorated inside the mirrored prison, far beyond the cold stone walls of Holloway House, another story was unfolding, one rooted in love, disbelief, and a sister's desperate hope. Her name was Clara Harrow, and for nearly a year, she had been searching for answers. It began with silence. Eliza's letters, once filled with poetic musings and stories from her work as a governess, had simply stopped. Weeks turned to months. Clara wrote again and again, sending letters to every address Eliza had ever mentioned. Her employer, the parish office, even the postmaster himself. Each time, the reply was the same. No record of such a woman in our employ. But Clara knew her sister. Eliza was not someone who simply disappeared, so Clara traveled to London herself. A woman alone in a city that saw women like her as fragile, foolish, or hysterical. She knocked on the doors of officials, hospitals, and churches, but the name Eliza Harrow had been scrubbed clean from every register. No death notice, no admission record, no trace at all. Inside Holloway House, meanwhile, Finch's staff had grown accustomed to intercepting letters addressed to patients. A small wooden box in his office held dozens of envelopes, unopened, unsent. Some carried tear stains, others bore faint perfume, all addressed with trembling handwriting. Among them were Clara's letters, each carefully opened, read and filed away by Finch's assistants, then quietly destroyed. He referred to them in his private notes as extraneous emotional interference. To Finch, family was an obstacle to science. To Clara, it was her only weapon. As Eliza scribbled her backward messages on the mirror, believing she was speaking to ghosts, her sister was still fighting for her, unaware that her words had never reached their destination. And somewhere within the mirrored walls, Eliza felt it. Some nights she would wake from uneasy sleep with the unshakable sensation that someone, somewhere, was calling her name. Eliza. The whisper would echo faintly through the glass, not from the phantoms, but from the memory of her sister's voice. In those brief moments, she almost remembered who she was. Almost. Clara's search took her to the edge of despair. Rumors of private reform homes for women began to surface in whispered conversations among servants and nurses. One name kept recurring, Holloway House. She wrote once more, addressing it directly. To whoever holds my sister against her will, please, let her write to me. I beg you. The letter never reached Eliza, but this time it didn't vanish into Finch's fire either. A week later, Clara received a package in the post. No return address. The wax seal was unfamiliar. The crest of no known institution. Inside was a single photograph, aged and grainy, clearly taken through glass. Eliza sat in the center of a white room, her face pale, her eyes hollow. Around her, the walls shimmered faintly, countless reflections of herself. Staring back, someone had captured her inside the mirror room. On the back of the photograph, written in elegant, trembling script, were just 4 words. She is still alive. By the spring of 1892, Eliza Harrow had been locked in the mirror room for over a year. She no longer marked time by days or nights, only by the rhythm of the flickering lamps and the whispers that haunted her sleep. But for Dr. Aldous Finch, her torment was only entering its most valuable phase. He called it the mirror tests. Finch was not merely a sadist. He saw himself as a scientist, a pioneer in what he described as reflex empathy. He believed that through mirrors, the human mind could be made to feel its own conscience, that guilt, shame, and defiance could be isolated like diseases and cured through reflection. In his private notes he wrote, "The self, when forced to face itself endlessly, either transcends or annihilates. Both outcomes serve progress. To him, Eliza was not a prisoner. She was proof." The mirror tests were cruel, methodical, and calculated. Finch began altering the lighting cycles, plunging the room into sudden bursts of brightness, then hours of total darkness. He piped in faint noises, heartbeats, whispers, the sound of distant crying, all designed to blur Eliza's perception of what was real. Sometimes, he would play recordings of her own voice, repeating phrases she didn't remember saying. "I am wrong. I must change. I am wrong." Her mind fractured further, her thoughts looping endlessly until even her reflection looked exhausted, her eyes dull, her body trembling. When she tried to look away from the mirrors, she found no escape. Every surface reflected her from a different angle, multiplied her despair. Even the floor shimmered faintly, catching her movements like a lake of glass. Finch watched from behind his two-way mirror, making careful notes as she screamed and begged for silence. He was documenting what he called empathic collapse, historical context, narrator's commentary. In Victorian England, psychological torture was often masked as science. Practices like mirror therapy and moral reflection were genuinely proposed, not as punishment but as treatment. Doctors believed that confronting one's image for long periods could cure insanity, force repentance, or reveal hidden guilt. Finch had twisted these crude theories into something far darker. He didn't seek to heal the mind. He sought to break it cleanly, to watch as identity dissolved into obedience. To him, madness was not failure. It was success. As Eliza's condition worsened, Finch grew more fascinated and more erratic. He began spending nights alone in the observation chamber, staring through the two-way mirror for hours, his notes growing increasingly erratic, his handwriting trembling. One evening, after hours of monitoring, he noticed something impossible. Eliza had fallen asleep on the floor, her body perfectly still. Yet in the mirror, her reflection moved, it stood. It turned toward him, and it smiled. Finch froze, his breath catching in his throat. He blinked, and the reflection was gone. Eliza remained on the floor, motionless. He leaned closer to the glass, his heart pounding, searching for any logical explanation. And then, in the faint fog of his breath on the mirror's surface, words began to appear, not written by his hand but forming on their own. Letter by letter, "We see you too." For the first time in his career, Dr. Finch took a step back from the glass. The man who had spent years watching others unravel now felt the cold, creeping sensation of being watched. The night of October 3rd, 1894, began like any other in Holloway House. Thick fog outside, the dull hum of the city far beyond the estate walls. But for Eliza Harrow, that night would become the longest and quietest of her life. At exactly midnight, the lights went out. No creak of lantern hinges. No hiss of the furnace pipes. Just silence. Deep, absolute, and suffocating. The mirror room, usually alive with flickers of candlelight and the soft hum of Finch's observation machines, became an abyss. Eliza woke to a darkness so dense it felt like water pressing against her skin. For a long time she didn't move. She simply listened, waiting for the faint tick of the wall clock, for Finch's footsteps above, for anything. Nothing came. She rose slowly, barefoot, the floor cold beneath her feet. In the darkness, she reached for the nearest wall to steady herself. Her palm brushed cold glass. But something was wrong. Every mirror in the room was fogged. A thick, clammy condensation covered each one, like breath from 1,000 unseen mouths, all except one. Across the room, faintly glowing in the dark, a single mirror stood clear. Through it, Eliza could see her reflection, but it wasn't asleep like she had been. It was standing, still, watching. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she took a step closer. The reflection tilted its head just slightly, not in sync with her movement, not as an echo, but as a response. "Eliza," the whisper came from nowhere and everywhere, carried through the dark like a breath of cold wind. Her reflection's lips hadn't moved, yet she heard her own voice calling her name. She stumbled back, knocking over a stool that clattered across the stone floor. the sound too sharp in the silence. The mirrors around her seemed to vibrate faintly, fog shifting as if stirred by unseen hands. Then came the sound, a crack, sudden and violent. The clear mirror splintered down the middle, its surface rippling like water struck by a stone. Before Eliza could move, the mirror exploded outward. Shards flew across the room, slicing the air with a shriek like glass screaming. She shielded her face, stumbling back until her spine hit the wall. For a long moment there was silence again, except for her breathing, ragged and uneven. Then through the fog and dust, she saw it. Behind where the mirror had stood, the plaster wall was fractured, not just broken but hollow. Through the cracks, faint candlelight flickered from somewhere behind the wall. Hands trembling, Eliza began pulling away the remaining glass shards, ignoring the cuts on her fingers. Each shard fell with a ringing sound that echoed through the empty halls like chimes. Finally, she uncovered it. A small, rusted door hidden behind the mirror frame, barely large enough for a person to crawl through. Its iron handle was cold and damp, marked with fingerprints that weren't hers, etched faintly into the metal. Beneath years of corrosion were 4 words: "Do not open alone." Eliza's breath came shallow, her mind screaming warnings, but curiosity or desperation pushed her forward. She knelt, reached for the handle and turned. The lock gave way with a groan that echoed through every corridor of Holloway House. The small iron door groaned open, releasing a wave of cold, damp air that smelled faintly of rust and old stone. Eliza held her breath as she peered into the narrow stairwell spiraling downward. Steps slick with moisture, walls sweating with decay. For a moment, she hesitated. The mirror room behind her felt like a tomb, but whatever lay below felt older, and worse. Still she descended. Each step creaked under her weight, the air growing colder, heavier, until even her breath turned visible. A faint rhythmic sound echoed from below, not footsteps, not machinery. It was the steady drip of water onto glass. When she reached the bottom, she found herself in a massive underground chamber, a hidden world beneath Holloway House. At first, she thought it was a storage room, but as her eyes adjusted to the dim light flickering from scattered lanterns, the truth unfolded. Mirrors. Hundreds of them, broken, cracked, stacked against the walls like discarded bodies. Some were whole, others shattered beyond recognition, their jagged surfaces reflecting Eliza's face in 100 twisted fragments. Each one bore a small brass plate, engraved with a name and a date. She knelt beside one. Catherine W., 1881. Recovered. Another read, Lydia March, 1874. Cured by reflection. The mirrors went back decades, hundreds of women, all labeled as patients, all marked recovered. Yet none of them appeared in any public records. It hit her like a blow to the chest. This wasn't an experiment. It was erasure. In the center of the chamber stood a large oak table. Scattered across it were dusty files, each bound in dark leather stamped with the seal of the Royal Psychological Society. Eliza flipped one open with shaking hands. Inside were documents, clinical notes, drawings, even photographs of the women whose names appeared on the mirrors. Each report ended with the same phrase, written in Dr. Finch's precise handwriting: subject successfully neutralized. Identity dissolved through sustained reflection. She read further. Pages describing Finch's theory that mirrors could not only alter perception, but rewrite existence. According to him, when the human mind was forced to confront its reflection for long enough, it would eventually separate from the self entirely. To Finch, this was purification. To his victims, it was obliteration. He called it the final stage, dissolution of self. As Eliza's eyes darted over the pages, she found one file that made her heart stop. The cover read simply, Subject 27, E. Harrow, her own name. Inside, in Finch's own handwriting, were detailed notes of her progress. Subject shows strong resistance to reflective hypnosis. Empathic rupture probable. Continue exposure. Final stage pending. And below that, in red ink, written just days earlier, a chilling note, erase from registry. Subject no longer real. Eliza dropped the file as if it had burned her. The papers scattered across the damp floor, pages curling in the moisture. Somewhere deep within the chamber, the mirrors began to hum faintly, not vibrating from air or sound, but from something alive within them. The reflection shifted, her face multiplied in every shard, now staring back with expressions she wasn't making. She stumbled backward, her breath quickening, and then from the darkness above came the familiar voice she had grown to dread, Dr. Aldous Finch. But this time, it wasn't coming from behind glass or through the walls, it was inside the chamber. "Eliza," the voice said softly, echoing from every corner of the room, distorted as though the mirrors themselves were speaking. "You've come so far, but you see, my dear, you are no longer real." The reflection nearest to her smiled, her own face, lips curling in a perfect imitation of Finch's cold satisfaction. The humming grew louder, the mirrors beginning to tremble. The chamber seemed to come alive, a chorus of glass whispering her name, pulling at the edges of her reality. The next morning, or what felt like morning, the gas lamps in the basement flickered to life on their own. The mirrors stood silent, their surfaces eerily still after the chaos of the night before. Eliza sat on the cold stone floor, exhausted, half believing she had dreamed it all. The chamber was quiet, yet the air felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. And then she heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps descending the stairs. Dr. Aldous Finch had come down to the basement of glass. He looked different now. Pale, trembling, sweat collecting along his brow. Gone was the air of calm control that once defined him. His eyes darted across the mirrors as if seeing them for the first time not as tools but as threats. "Eliza," he said softly, his voice echoing, "it's time for your final session." But she didn't respond. She simply watched him, through the reflection. Finch set down his notebook on the central table, his fingers shaking as he flipped to a blank page. "This will conclude your treatment," he said, more to himself than to her. "We will bring the self into perfect alignment." He adjusted his coat and raised a hand to the largest intact mirror in the room, the same one that had first shown Eliza's reflection moving on its own. He looked into it and the mirror looked back. But something was wrong. The reflection was late, a half-second behind. Then as Finch blinked, it didn't blink with him. His expression froze. He glanced over his shoulder. Eliza was still there, motionless, watching. He turned back to the mirror and saw himself smiling. A smile he wasn't making. Finch stumbled backward, colliding with the table. His notebook fell, pages scattering like frightened birds. The reflection stepped closer to the glass, its movement fluid, deliberate, and independent. It tilted its head, studying him like a specimen. What is this?" he whispered. "Why are you—" The reflection raised its hand and pressed it to the glass. Finch, trembling, hesitated, then lifted his own hand, unable to stop himself. When their palms met, the surface rippled, like water disturbed by a drop of ink, and in that moment, it pulled. Finch gasped as the reflection gripped his hand from the other side, an impossible touch, cold and sharp. He tried to pull away, but his arm began to sink into the glass inch by inch. Panic flooded his face as he screamed, "Eliza, help me!" But Eliza only stood there, her face blank, her eyes hollow, as if she were seeing justice unfold in the most terrible way possible. The mirrors all around began to shimmer. In their depths, Eliza could see shapes, women, hundreds of them, faces trapped behind the glass, watching in silence. As Finch struggled, their reflections reached forward, their palms pressing against their invisible prisons. The reflection, his reflection, now had both his arms. Finch's body twisted unnaturally as he was dragged further inside the mirror. The glass did not shatter. It absorbed him, rippling like liquid mercury until only his face remained, wide-eyed and screaming. Then, silence. The reflection straightened, smoothed its coat, and adjusted its spectacles. A perfect copy of Dr. Finch. But the real Finch was gone. Eliza slowly stepped forward. In the mirror, the doctor's reflection smiled, but behind that smile, something shifted. It was her face now, blending into his. Eliza's reflection stood taller, clearer, stronger, not broken or terrified, but in control. The doctor's voice echoed faintly in the air, disembodied and weak. Who am I?" The reflection turned its gaze directly at Eliza, and this time it smiled not with madness but with purpose. For the first time in 10 years, Eliza Harrow felt air that didn't taste of dust and chemicals. She stumbled through the cracked wooden door, out of the basement of glass and into the open night. The rain fell softly against her face. The wind was cold and it felt real. She looked up and saw the London sky, not through mirrors, not through glass, but directly. It was freedom, or so she thought. Holloway House loomed behind her like a dark silhouette, its windows black and silent. No guards. No Dr. Finch. No sound at all. The cobblestone path stretched ahead, leading toward the gas-lit streets of London. Her bare feet slapped the wet stones as she walked, each step heavy with disbelief and exhaustion. But as she passed the first row of shops, something began to feel wrong. The city was too still. Every window she passed reflected not her surroundings but the mirror room. She stopped before a large storefront window, a dressmaker's display. In the glass she saw herself, pale and trembling. But the reflection wasn't wearing her tattered asylum dress. It was still wearing the same white patient's gown from Holloway. Her heart sank. She turned away. The reflection didn't. It stayed there, still watching her, as if frozen in another world. And then it smiled. Panic clawed at her chest. She ran down the street, calling out for help. "Is anyone there? Please." Her voice echoed, but no doors opened. No footsteps answered. She turned a corner, expecting to find the familiar bustle of London life. Carriage wheels, the smell of coal fires, the chatter of markets. Instead, she found silence again. Every window, every puddle, every polished surface reflected not the city, but her room, the walls, the mirrors, the door she had just escaped through. She spun in circles, gasping, her breath fogging in the cold air. The reflection in the nearest window stepped closer, but this time it wasn't her. It was Finch. His face stared at her from inside the reflection, pale and trembling. He mouthed something she couldn't hear. Then the glass rippled, and his image vanished. Eliza pressed her hands against the nearest window pane. It felt warm. She saw the faint outline of her cell behind it, the metal bed frame, the scattered glass shards, the dim gaslight flickering above. Her voice broke as she whispered, "No. I got out. I'm out." But the world around her began to shimmer. The rain freezing mid-air, droplets suspended like beads of mercury. The city faded, its edges dissolving into a sea of reflected light, and then she heard it, a whisper, calm and resonant, filling every echoing surface. She escaped into reflection. The world inverted. Darkness rushed in from every side. Eliza fell backward, screaming. But no sound came out. When the light returned, she was back in the mirror room. Same walls. Same silence, only now she was on the other side of the glass. Her reflection, calm, composed, free, stood outside the mirror, looking in at her. It tilted its head gently, just as she had years ago, and whispered through the barrier, "It's better here." Then it turned away, and walked out of Holloway House. Eliza pressed her hands to the mirror, pounding, crying out for someone to see her, to hear her. But no one ever would, because the woman the world now knew as Eliza Harrow was gone. Only the reflection remained, smiling softly in the rain. 5 years after Holloway House was officially shut down, whispers still haunted the corridors of London's Ministry of Health and Moral Reform. A sealed report sat on a mahogany desk stamped confidential, royal order, its spine labeled, The Holloway Inquiry, 1899. It began as a small investigation, a clerical audit of missing patient records from London's asylums. But as investigators followed the paper trail, they found an anomaly. Dozens of women listed as rehabilitated and released, yet none of them were ever seen again. Their birth certificates, property records, and even baptism entries had been quietly erased from public registry. It was as though they had never existed. The inquiry was led by Inspector Arthur Llewellyn, a former Scotland Yard detective known for his precision and skepticism. At first he assumed it was a bureaucratic error, misplaced files, sloppy accounting, until he read the name Dr. Aldous Finch. Finch's reputation had been spotless, a respected psychiatrist, even rumored to have corresponded with members of the Royal Society. But buried in the archives of Bedlam Hospital, Llewellyn found a letter addressed to Finch from a man identified only as Lord. The letter praised Finch for his pioneering work in reflection therapy and enclosed a payment of $5,000 to continue the trials. The deeper Llewellyn dug, the darker it became. Witnesses were called, surviving nurses, former staff, even local townsfolk who lived near Holloway House. Their testimonies painted a picture of horror. One nurse, her hands trembling as she spoke, recalled, "We were told the women were sinners, adulteresses, thieves, witches. Dr. Finch said the mirrors would cleanse their souls, but we never saw them come out." Another, older and nearly blind, whispered, "There was a room below the ground. We called it the looking glass. Once they went there, the doors never opened again." But when Llewellyn asked for architectural plans of Holloway House, none existed. The official records ended at room 11. No one could find room 12. When investigators finally gained access to the estate, they found it in ruin. Walls collapsed, corridors warped by time. In the basement, they discovered fragments of glass buried in the soil, their edges still shining like frost. But the strangest discovery came when they unearthed a collection of burned documents sealed inside a rusted tin box. Among them was Finch's final journal entry. "The reflection accepts what the mind rejects. To erase sin, one must erase self. The subjects are no longer bound by flesh, owned us only by the mirror's mercy." The handwriting ended abruptly. The rest of the page was smeared as if by a wet handprint. Parliament debated the case for months, but no arrests were ever made. Most of the surviving evidence was destroyed for the preservation of public order. Officially, Holloway House was recorded as an unlicensed correctional asylum, later demolished after structural instability. Yet behind closed doors, the story spread through the upper halls of London's elite. A house where women disappeared, a doctor who turned madness into science, and a room, unseen by any living soul, that reflected more than faces. The narrator's voice lowers, grave and deliberate. Of the 13 rooms documented in the blueprints of Holloway House, 12 were recovered. Room 12 was never found. More than a century after Holloway House was torn down, its story had faded into little more than a grim footnote in London's forgotten archives. But history, as the narrator begins, has a way of resurfacing, especially when it comes in the shape of a reflection. In 2023, a private auction was held at a discreet estate in Kent, a sale for Victorian curiosities and institutional relics. Among the items, rusted medical instruments, hand-bound patient ledgers, and a collection of mirrors listed simply as Lot 47. Holloway glass panels. The auctioneer, an older man with shaking hands, warned bidders not to touch the pieces directly. "They're fragile," he said with a forced smile, and somewhat unsettling. The panels were tall, beveled mirrors with strange distortions, their surfaces faintly rippled, as if they'd been under heat or pressure. At the corner of each one, almost too faint to see, was a number etched into the glass, 1 through 11. Room 11. Room 12 was not among them. A collector named Simon Hargreaves, a retired art historian and self-proclaimed skeptic of the supernatural, purchased 3 of the mirrors for his private gallery in South London. He often boasted in interviews about debunking haunted antiques by displaying them publicly. But within a week of the delivery, his staff began to report odd occurrences. One assistant claimed that while cleaning the glass, she saw a woman's silhouette standing behind her, though the room was empty. Another swore that the reflection of the gallery's doorway stayed visible for several seconds after the real door had closed. Simon dismissed it all as optical afterimages and continued hosting private viewings. That was until the night of October 3rd, the anniversary of Eliza Holloway's escape. At 11:47 p.m., Simon began recording a live stream for his online channel, documenting his latest acquisitions. The footage was meant to be mundane, an academic tour of Victorian artifacts. But what the audience saw was anything but ordinary. As he spoke in front of the central mirror describing its remarkable preservation, his reflection began to move a fraction of a second slower than he did. Then slower still. Viewers noticed before he did. Comments flooded the stream. "Is that edited?" His reflection just blinked. "Look behind him." Simon turned, expecting to catch a trick of light. Nothing. He laughed nervously, adjusting the camera, but in the reflection his counterpart didn't laugh. It stared straight into the lens. The video cut to static. When police later entered the gallery, they found no signs of forced entry, only shattered glass, scattered across the floor in a perfect circle. Simon Hargreaves was gone. The mirrors, however, were intact again, stacked neatly against the wall. One of them bore a new engraving that hadn't been there before. Room 12. News outlets dismissed the event as an elaborate hoax. But among historians and folklore researchers, whispers began to circulate once more about the Holloway reflections. Cursed mirrors said to contain echoes of erased women. The narrator returns, voice calm yet ominous. Eliza Holloway's name is still missing from every official record, but her reflection, they say, never stopped moving. As the screen fades to black, grainy found footage appears, a shaky phone recording of a dimly lit room. A single antique mirror stands in the center. For a moment the reflection is still. Then, it smiles. The past never fades. It only waits for someone brave enough to look back. The screen remains black for a few seconds, silent, breathless. Then a faint shimmer glides across the darkness, like light moving through glass. From that shimmer, the outline of the Victorian mirror returns one last time. But now its surface is perfectly still. No reflection, no movement. A single line of text appears across the mirror. Holloway House was demolished in 1901. The mirrors were never found. The faint sound of footsteps echoes in the distance. 2, then 1, then silence. A final flicker of Eliza's reflection appears, barely visible, her eyes calm, her lips forming one last silent phrase. I remember. The glass clouds over. Everything fades.